The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical prayer as Rachel Torres pushed the crash cart through the third-floor corridor of St. Michael's ICU in Denver, her movements precise as a metronome, her eyes fixed on the monitors ahead. Nobody looked at her twice. The faded scrubs hung loose on her frame, a size too large, deliberately chosen from a donation bin 3 years ago, and her ID badge came from a temp agency that changed names every rotation. To the staff walking past, she was invisible. A placeholder. Just another body filling a shift at a hospital that cycled nurses through like oxygen tanks. The antiseptic smell of the unit wrapped around her like a familiar uniform. Bleach mixed with something darker underneath, the faint copper undertone of old blood that never fully washed out of these corridors. She'd been moving through hospitals like this one for 36 months, each assignment lasting exactly long enough to earn a paycheck and leave before anyone asked questions about her previous credentials. The Pentagon had been very clear about the rules: vanish. No forwarding address. No LinkedIn profile. No medical records that traced back to Captain Rachel Torres, who officially ceased existing the moment the black site outside Kandahar burned and 16 senators decided that night had never happened. She reached the ICU station and found the patient list for the day. Room 7, Colonel Marcus Harrison, 67 years old, admitted with sepsis following a scheduled cardiac surgery. The surgical team had placed a central line 3 days ago. Basic procedure, should have been textbook. But the line was running warm, and his fever hadn't budged in 16 hours. She pulled the chart. The most recent notation was Dr. Pierce's handwriting: patient stable. Routine step-down expected within 48 hours. The date stamp read 6:11 a.m. It was now 10:14 a.m. Rachel moved into room 7 without announcing herself. The man in the bed was built like a granite monument, 6'2", broad shoulders, the kind of frame that came from decades of PT and purpose. His hair had gone silver at the temples, and there were scars on his forearms that told stories in a language most people couldn't read. But his eyes. His eyes were the color of old rifle steel, and they tracked her movement the moment her hand touched the fall line. She didn't introduce herself. The chart said he'd received 2 doses of antibiotics and 1 fluid bolus since midnight. His vital signs showed a pattern she'd learned to recognize in another life: temperature climbing in a steady line like an altimeter, heart rate compensating, blood pressure starting to slip. The central line site itself looked clean from the outside, but she knew better than to trust what she could see. She ran her gloved fingers along the catheter hub, feeling for the subtle warmth that shouldn't be there. Found it immediately. Need to check this line, she said quietly, her voice pitched low and deferential, the way she'd learned to speak in this new life. No authority. No medical confidence. Just a tired temp nurse doing her job. She began unwrapping the transparent dressing, moving with the kind of economy of motion that came from muscle memory rather than training manuals. 16 years of it. 3 tours. 2 Purple Hearts worth of it. The blade came from the emergency kit, a standard surgical knife, nothing special, the kind of instrument every ICU kept for situations that called for speed over ceremony. She held it at a 45-degree angle, the same angle she'd learned in a field hospital with mortar rounds walking their way across the compound, with blood pooled on the floor and 17 minutes to decide who lived and who didn't. The angle mattered. The angle was everything. She poised the blade at the skin around the catheter insertion point and paused. Just paused. The way a musician pauses before the crescendo. The way a sniper exhales before the shot. The blade was already moving through the muscle memory of her hands before her conscious mind caught up, one smooth motion, precise as a surgeon's laser, confident as someone who'd done this exact procedure in a tent during a dust storm with nothing but combat trauma experience and the knowledge that hesitation killed people faster than infection ever could. The old man in the bed went absolutely still. His eyes locked on her blade angle, on the specific rotation of her wrist, on the way her opposite hand braced the tissue without applying pressure, techniques that weren't in any civilian nursing textbook, movements that lived only in the muscle memory of field medics and battlefield surgeons. His breath came shallow. She felt it more than heard it. She was already opening the line, already examining the catheter tip, already finding the dark bacterial slime coating the insertion point that explained the fever and the warm site and the downward trend in his blood pressure that everyone else had missed. "Infected," she said, her voice still deferential, still small. She withdrew the contaminated catheter with a smooth pull that left no tissue damage. "I'll need a new one. Different location. Right subclavian." That was when he whispered it. "Kandahar." 2 syllables. Barely audible. Just the word itself, soft as a prayer, his eyes widening as recognition flooded his face. She felt the moment he connected the dots, the blade angle, the confident hands, the way she'd opened that infected line like she'd done it before, like she'd done it when the world was burning and the only thing between dead and alive was knowing exactly which way to turn your wrist. Rachel Torres didn't move. Didn't flinch. Didn't give him the satisfaction of confirmation. Instead, she caught his eye for exactly 1 second, and then she shook her head. The slightest movement. A negation. A warning. A silent conversation in a language only operators understood. "You didn't see this. You don't know me. We were never here." She turned away and began prepping the new line site, her hand steady as surgical steel, her movements economical and precise. Behind her, she could feel the moment Harrison understood. The silence in the room changed its quality. It went from the ordinary quiet of an ICU to something heavier, the kind of silence that comes when someone realizes they are standing next to a ghost. She placed the new central line in 40 seconds flat. The puncture was clean. The catheter threaded smooth. The guide wire positioning took 3 small adjustments, each one calculated with the precision of someone who'd done this in the dark using only tactile feedback and the faint sound of arterial blood hissing against a blade. She sutured it closed with 4 perfect stitches, each not identical to the last. Muscle memory. 3 years of trying to forget it, but it lived in her hands anyway, waiting for moments like this. "Antibiotics are working now," she said quietly, still using the voice of the temp nurse, the invisible woman everyone forgot. "You'll feel better in 6 hours." The old operator in the bed didn't answer. She didn't expect him to. She cleaned up the old line's equipment, disposed of the contaminated catheter in the biohazard container with the same care she'd once used folding up surgical instruments in a field hospital where the shelling never stopped and the only prayer available was the one you whispered to your own hands. She'd gotten good at folding things carefully. At containing the evidence. At making herself small enough to disappear. Her locker was in the nurse's station basement, down 3 flights of stairs that smelled like industrial detergent and something underneath that might have been fear or might have been resignation. She kept almost nothing there. A change of scrubs. A pair of surgical clogs. A badge that would expire in 2 weeks when this rotation ended. And one other thing. She opened the locker slowly, letting the door swing inward on its hinges. The small folded flag was tucked in the back corner, carefully positioned so the points of the star faced outward. 13 stars. The old flag, the one the Pentagon had officially erased along with her entire unit. Her hands touched the fabric without thinking about it, just her fingers checking the folds were still crisp, the edges still perfectly aligned, the way she'd folded it during her last morning in Kandahar when she was still someone who had a rank and a unit and a future written in official documents instead of redacted black marker. Lieutenant Sarah Chen's flag. 19 years old. Wyoming ranch kid. Fastest reflexes in the unit. Dead for 36 months, officially never deployed, buried in a cemetery her family thought was just a hiking accident. The Pentagon's explanation. The story that killed her twice. Rachel closed her eyes and held the flag against her chest for 3 seconds. Just 3. That was the rule she'd set for herself. Don't cry. Don't break. Don't let 3 years of hiding turn into 1 moment of remembering. She folded it back into the corner of the locker with the same precision she'd used folding the catheter line, with the same care she'd applied to opening that infected line in room 7, with the same steady hands that had forgotten how to tremble the moment someone decided that 16 senators and a redaction stamp mattered more than the truth. 3 flights back up. The ICU smelled like it always did. The monitors beeped their electronic rhythm. Nobody looked at her as she passed Dr. Pierce's office, where he was reviewing something on his computer. His expression carried the kind of casual arrogance that came from never having been questioned, never having been tested, never having been wrong in any way that stuck. He glanced up as she walked past his door, his eyes moving through her without catching anything at all. She went back to work. The rest of the shift unfolded in the ordinary rhythm of clinical care, vital signs at the top of every hour, medication administration at prescribed intervals, the gentle competence that nobody noticed because it was working. Harrison's fever began dropping by hour 3. The new central line ran clear. The antibiotics started doing their job. By the time Rachel's shift ended at 6 p.m., his temperature had fallen to 100.1 and climbing back toward normal with the trajectory of someone who'd caught the infection in time. She was clocking out at the main desk when a voice came from behind her. "You sure about that line placement?" Dr. Pierce. Hands on his hips. The tone that said he wasn't asking a question, he was conducting an interrogation. She turned around slowly and met his eyes without expression, the way the temp nurse was supposed to behave. Deferential. Uncertain. Ready to apologize. The patient was stable, she said quietly. I documented the old line at the bedside. I saw the old line. Clean as anything. His voice had shifted. Something had changed in his face. The casual arrogance was still there, but underneath it something darker had started to grow, the beginning of suspicion, the first seed of something that might become dangerous if it was left to take root. The medication room at St. Michael's smelled like antiseptic and industrial-strength coffee. Rachel was reaching for Colonel Harrison's morning labs when Dr. Pierce pushed through the door, his voice already pitched loud enough for the entire ICU to hear. 3 nurses stopped working. A resident froze mid-charting. "Tell me, Torres," Pierce said, his tone like a blade sliding between ribs, "which nursing school exactly? I don't recall seeing your name on any Johns Hopkins roster. Or was it one of those accelerated programs? Online, perhaps?" Rachel met his gaze with a flat stare. Said nothing. The silence stretched, 3 seconds, 4. A nurse in the corner suddenly found her computer screen very interesting. Because competent medication reconciliation requires actual credentials, Pierce continued, his voice climbing just slightly, playing to his audience now, "and I've been meaning to verify yours with human resources." He smiled. The smile didn't reach his eyes. "We have such high standards here." Rachel turned back to the medication cabinet. Pulled out the 4-drip setup for bed 7. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. She simply continued working as if he'd said nothing at all, as if the room hadn't gone so quiet you could hear the ventilator hissing in the ICU beyond the door. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part happened at 1100 hours, outside Colonel Harrison's room, when the afternoon shift was beginning and families started arriving. Rachel was reviewing lab results, glucose, electrolytes, white count trending up, when she noticed something Pierce had scribbled on the medication order. The dosage was wrong. 0.5 milliliters too much. Not a decimal error. A calculation error. The kind that could kill someone in a 73-year-old with compromised kidney function. An intern was standing 3 feet away, reading the same order. Rachel's voice was quiet. "That's incorrect, Dr. Pierce." He turned. The intern's head snapped up. "The renal clearance on this patient is 32. You're accounting for standard function." Rachel pointed to the chart with one surgical precise finger. 0.5 milliliters too much. I'd recommend recalculating. The intern's eyes moved between them like a spectator at a very dangerous tennis match. Pierce's jaw tightened, a visible clench that lasted exactly 1 second. Then his face rearranged itself into something that looked almost like courtesy. "Thank you for the input, temporary," he said, using the new nickname he'd been testing all morning. "However, my calculations were correct. Perhaps your accelerated program didn't cover advanced pharmacokinetics." But his hands were already moving toward the order. Already crossing it out. Because he knew. The room knew. The intern definitely knew. Rachel said nothing. She simply resumed her work with the kind of calm that came from having already survived worse things than a surgeon's wounded pride. By afternoon, the break room became a geography of avoidance. 2 nurses picked up their coffee and left when Rachel entered at 1,445 hours. A third, Shonda, who'd been friendly on Rachel's first shift, suddenly remembered urgent charting. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in glass. But it was what happened at 16:30 that would have destroyed most people. Rachel was performing her rounds, checking on Colonel Harrison's vitals. The numbers were climbing slightly, temperature 38.1, white count elevated, and she was reviewing the lab workup when Pierce arrived with Colonel Harrison's wife and daughter. They were dressed in their best clothes. The daughter had flowers. "Ms. Torres," Pierce said, his voice dipped in that false concern that was somehow worse than anger, "I need to address a pattern I've been noticing. A concerning habit of overstepping your scope." Rachel's hand stilled over the 4 pump. She didn't turn around. "You ordered sepsis workup labs without consulting with a physician first," Pierce continued, his voice rising just enough for the family to hear clearly. "That's a diagnostic decision, Ms. Torres. That's a doctor's job. When nurses start thinking they're physicians, when they start making decisions outside their training, people die." He paused. "Let that land. I'm sure you understand the importance of staying in your lane." The daughter's face had gone soft with sympathy. For the doctor. Rachel could feel it like weight. She turned. Looked at Colonel Harrison's wife directly. Then at Pierce. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet it cut through everything else in the room like a scalpel through silk. "I hope your malpractice carrier is paid up, doctor, because that man would have been dead in 4 hours." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens when someone has just said something true and unforgivable in front of witnesses. The daughter's mouth opened. Colonel Harrison's wife stepped closer to her husband. Pierce's face flushed red, then darker, and his hand came up in a gesture that was almost, but not quite, a point. "That's insubordination," he said quietly. "And you should be very careful about making accusations." But Rachel had already turned back to the monitor. Already returned to her work. The fact that she wouldn't look at him, that she dismissed him so completely, seemed to anger him far more than if she'd fought. The next morning, a write-up appeared on the unit board. Official. Formal. Posted where everyone would see it, formal documentation of insubordination, Nurse Rachel Torres, 0400 hours, posted per Dr. Marcus Pierce, MD, patient safety concern, unauthorized diagnostic decisions, insubordinate response to direct correction. Webb, the medic in bed 7, read it while Rachel was changing his dressing. His hands clenched into fists. His eyes looked like someone watching a friend die in slow motion while unable to move. "You caught the sepsis before labs came back," he said quietly, his voice rough from the ventilator. The culture wouldn't have been positive for another 18 hours. By then. "Don't," Rachel said. "Finish the dressing with 3 efficient movements. Don't say anything." "I know who you are," Webb whispered. "I know exactly who you are, and this is." Rachel's hand pressed against the 4-line, gentle, but firm. A motion that looked completely clinical to anyone watching. Especially not that. When she left his room, she paused outside the door for exactly 4 seconds. Her jaw was clenched so tight you could see the muscle working beneath her skin. Her hands, steady as surgical instruments for the last 2 hours, had begun to shake. But that wasn't fear. That wasn't anything close to fear. The trembling was restraint. It was the physical manifestation of 18 years of training, of discipline forged under fire, of a captain who had learned to carry things that would break ordinary people into pieces. She pressed her palms against her thighs. Waited for the shaking to stop. By the time she was back at the nurse's station, her hands were steady again, and her face was blank, the kind of blank that had become her armor, her camouflage, her way of surviving in a world that would destroy her if it ever learned her name. Pierce was watching from across the unit. She could feel his eyes on her back like a targeting laser. He'd gotten a taste of something real, competence he couldn't match, authority he couldn't challenge, a nurse who looked him in the eye and made him choose between his pride and his license. That kind of man didn't forget. That kind of man didn't forgive. That kind of man started making phone calls. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was already beginning. The code blue alarm cut through St. Michael's ICU like a chainsaw through silk. Day 2. 1,400 hours. Colonel Harrison's surgical site had ruptured during what was supposed to be a routine step-down transfer from the trauma wing, blood soaking through the transport sheet in sheets that came faster than anyone could wipe them away. His chest heaved once. Twice. Then nothing but the terrible flatline scream of the cardiac monitor. Dr. Pierce appeared in the doorway, his face already performing concern like an actor who'd memorized the part. Get a crash cart. Move. His voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question, a man who'd built his reputation on appearing to command rooms he barely understood. Behind him, the resident, Thompson, a good kid with shaking hands and eyes the size of dinner plates, fumbled for a scalpel. Dropped it. Reached for another with trembling fingers that betrayed everything his training was supposed to have prepared him for. Rachel was already moving. She didn't call out. Didn't announce herself. She simply shoved the resident aside with a shoulder and grabbed the crash cart in one fluid motion that came from somewhere deeper than thought, from the muscle memory of a field hospital outside Kandahar where decisions measured in seconds meant the difference between a man walking out or being carried out. The crash cart wheels squeaked, a sound like an animal's final breath, as she wheeled it into position. "What are you doing?" Pierce's voice climbed toward indignation. "Step back." "You're not." "Crash cart. Now." She didn't look at him. Didn't ask. Commands, not requests. Her hands were already moving through the supply inventory with the precision of someone who'd done this before, would do it again, would keep doing it until every person in the room understood she was the only one qualified to save what remained of Colonel Harrison's life. Thompson stared at her, still holding the unused scalpel. Pierce opened his mouth, a mistake, but his mouth was always his worst instinct. Rachel had already found what she needed, the emergency kit with its sealed instruments, the sterile field kit, the sanitized combat knife that lived in every field medical supply because sometimes you didn't have time for the electric saw, didn't have the space for the traditional chest spreader, didn't have anything except your hands and the knowledge that the heart in front of you was worth saving. "Get me 1 milligram epi for 100 milliliters bolus normal saline, and suctioning capability," Rachel said, and there was something in her voice that made Thompson move without hesitation, that made even Pierce's protests die unspoken in his throat. Now. The knife felt like coming home. Cold steel. Sharp enough to move through tissue like water, precise enough that a tremor would mean death, steady enough that her hands that had held lives together in tents, in bunkers, under fire, didn't shake. Not once. Not ever. Not in front of an audience that needed to believe their hospital was safe, their doctors competent, their systems sound. She opened his chest. One motion. The blade moved through skin, through subcutaneous tissue, through muscle with the kind of grace that only comes from having already survived the worst. The ribs were next. She positioned the knife at the fourth intercostal space and moved with the confidence of someone operating not in the sterile hum of Denver's St. Michael's, but in the cordite-soaked heat of a field hospital where surgeons worked on cots and morphine was rationed, and you learned to do this without hesitation because hesitation was another word for letting someone die. Her other hand was already in position, fingers moving with the automated precision of muscle memory, finding the pericardium, the sac that held the dying heart, opening it with a touch so gentle it contradicted the violence of what she was doing. "Come on," she whispered. Not to the room. To him. To Colonel Harrison, whose eyes had been open that first morning when she'd placed the central line, whose eyes had recognized her when no one else had, who'd known exactly who she was and kept the secret locked behind military discipline and the kind of honor that transcends everything, rank, clearance, paperwork that 16 senators had decided never existed. The heart lay exposed. Gray. Motionless. Wrong. Hands that had cracked chests under mortar fire, that had used broken ribs as architecture for saving, moved without permission from her brain. 30 seconds. That's all it took. Her palm was against the ventricle. Compressions, direct manual massage, the kind of intimate violence that only worked when you understood that the alternative was worse. The blood that spilled across her palms was warm. Copper and salt. The smell of it triggered something older than training, the synaptic memory of Kandahar, of field tents, of names she wasn't allowed to remember. Come on, sir. Still quiet. Still only for him. Thompson was moving now, feeding her the supplies like a man watching a conductor he'd finally learned to trust. Pierce was still in the doorway, his face draining of color as he understood, not what was happening, but what it meant that a temporary nurse from an agency roster was cracking a chest with a combat knife like she'd done it before, like she did it the way other people breathed. The heart shifted. Stuttered. Then. Sinus rhythm. The monitor sang it back in real time, the steady blip 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 of a heart remembering how to beat, of a colonel finding his way back from the edge. Rachel's hands were still moving, still working, still holding him to life by nothing except will and the kind of muscle memory that didn't fade, couldn't fade, wouldn't fade because forgetting was the same as letting them die all over again. Get me 2 milligrams midazolam, 100 milligrams succinylcholine for intubation, she said, and her voice was steady. Prepare for thoracic closure. We need to get him to the OR in the next 6 minutes or this doesn't hold. Thompson was already moving. The resident was already moving. Even Pierce, finally understanding that he was watching someone perform surgery that his own hands could never manage, was already stepping back to let the people who knew what they were doing save the man bleeding on the transport stretcher. 42 seconds, from code to stable rhythm. Rachel's hands were still inside Colonel Harrison's chest when Pierce's phone came out. She didn't see it, but her training had taught her to perceive peripherals, to understand threat vectors in ways that transcended normal awareness. She felt the presence of that phone the way soldiers feel incoming fire, not because she could see it, but because the air itself changed when a predator was hunting. She kept working. The closure came next, careful, methodical, the kind of work that had to be perfect because infection in a thoracotomy was another word for slow death. Sutures that held like prayer. The kind of precision that only came from hands that had learned their trade in places where there were no second chances, no malpractice insurance, just the simple binary of live or die. By the time they had Colonel Harrison loaded for the OR, by the time the surgical team was already waiting upstairs, by the time Thompson was looking at her like she'd just descended from heaven or somewhere much darker depending on his theological alignment, the email was already typed. Rachel didn't need to see it to know it was there. She could taste the threat in the air, antiseptic and human fear and the particular flavor of professional jealousy that only developed in men like Pierce, who'd spent careers being the smartest person in rooms until they encountered someone smarter and colder and willing to do the things they only talked about. She stood in the supply closet 20 minutes later, finally removing her gloves, and that's when her hands started to shake. Not from the emergency. Not from the crisis. Not from anything except the delayed understanding that she'd just revealed herself to the entire unit, had just showed them who Captain Rachel Torres really was, had just made herself unmissable and unforgettable and catastrophically memorable in ways that made her invisibility, 3 years of careful temp agency rotations, of fake references, of being the nurse nobody bothered to remember, entirely useless. The folded flag in her locker suddenly felt heavier. 13 stars. 1 teammate's worth of sacrifice. And now, in the next hours, in the next phone calls, in the decisions being made in administrative offices where people who'd never held a scalpel decided what people who had were allowed to do, that flag would become evidence. That flag would become a problem. That flag would become the reason she couldn't stay. She already knew how this ended. She'd always known. The text came through at 18:47 hours. Security escort to the locker room. Badge deactivated. Contract terminated. Board review pending. When she saw Pierce in the hallway, his voice dripping with the false regret of a man who'd finally won, the careful performance of someone expressing concern he would never genuinely feel, she understood that 2 days after she saved a dying colonel, the Pentagon's erased captain was about to vanish again, this time into something darker than civilian life. This time into being nobody at all. The supply closet smelled like antiseptic and failure. Rachel's hands shook for the first time all night, not from fear, but from the adrenaline bleeding out of her system like a wound finally allowed to bleed. The post-op note sat on the metal shelf in front of her, pen trembling against the paper. She steadied her fingers. Breathed. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint finally releasing. She'd cracked a chest with a sanitized knife. She'd called for a crash cart and nobody had stopped her. For 17 minutes, she'd become Captain Rachel Torres instead of Rachel the temp nurse, and the room had moved around her like water around a stone. Now the stone was sinking. She wrote the post-op documentation with the same meticulous precision she'd once used filling out casualty reports in a field hospital outside Kandahar, where the walls were canvas and the floor was blood-soaked dirt and you had 90 seconds to decide who lived and who didn't. Muscle memory. That's all this was. The same steady hand that had sutured a severed femoral artery under mortar fire wrote now, patient presented with surgical site rupture during step-down transfer. Emergency intervention initiated per protocol. O2 saturation recovered from 54% to 92% within minutes. Sinus rhythm restored. Patient stable for ICU readmission. The words were careful. The words were evidence. The words were the last thing she'd ever document at St. Michael's. Within the hour, Dr. Pierce made 3 phone calls. The first was to hospital administration. The second was to the Colorado Board of Nursing. The third was to the medical director. Rachel didn't hear these calls. She didn't see Pierce moving through the corridors with a smile that looked like a predator's, all teeth and calculation. She didn't know that he'd already pulled the security footage from the trauma bay and edited it with the precision of a man who'd spent 20 years weaponizing every tool available to him. The edited clip showed her hands moving, the knife going in, the blood, the unauthorized procedure, but it didn't show Colonel Harrison's O2 dropping to 44. It didn't show the resident frozen with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. It didn't show Pierce standing in the doorway doing absolutely nothing while a man died in front of him. It showed only what Pierce needed it to show, the temp nurse exceeding her scope, committing an assault with a surgical instrument, violating every protocol that kept hospitals functioning. The medical director watched the clip 3 times. Then he called administration. Then he called the state board representative who happened to be a golf friend, the kind of friend who understood that protecting the hospital's reputation was more important than understanding context. By the time Rachel finished her 3rd page of post-op notes, the decision had already been made. She was a liability. She was a lawsuit waiting to happen. She was the end of Dr. Pierce's problem. He arrived at her workstation with the hospital administrator and 2 security officers while she was still writing. His voice had transformed into something almost sympathetic, the voice of a man forced to deliver tragic news, a man who'd tried everything to save her career but simply couldn't. Ms. Torres, he began, and the use of her civilian surname felt like a small violence. I'm afraid we have to discuss some very serious concerns about what occurred this afternoon. Rachel set down her pen. Looked up. Her face showed nothing. Her hand stayed still. The unauthorized surgical procedure, Pierce continued, his eyes moving between her and the administrator like a conductor guiding an orchestra. Using hospital equipment in ways that violate your scope of practice. It puts us all in an impossible position, you understand. Legally, we have no choice. His expression was so full of regret it would have been convincing if she didn't know the man underneath, the man who'd watched her save a life and decided she was a threat to his carefully constructed world. The Board of Nursing has already been notified. Your case will be reviewed. I'm truly sorry, but we're going to have to terminate your contract effective immediately. I understand, Rachel said. 8 words. Spoken like someone accepting a traffic citation. Like someone who'd already absorbed worse news than this. Security will escort you to collect your personal items, the administrator added. We'd prefer you exit through the service entrance. It's less disruptive for staff. Translation, we don't want anyone to see you being walked out. We want you gone before questions get asked. The locker room was empty. Everyone was upstairs with Colonel Harrison, or dealing with the fallout from the code, or pretending none of this had happened. Rachel opened her locker. 2 pairs of clean scrubs. A water bottle. The medication note she'd written for herself on a yellow sticky note. And at the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper the color of old bone, the 13-star flag she'd pulled from its hiding place 3 days ago when she first recognized Colonel Harrison's bearing, his military posture, the way he moved like someone who'd carried weight that civilians couldn't see. She held it without unfolding it. The flag was small. The weight was immense. It had belonged to a medic named James Chen, 24 years old, from Sacramento, California. He'd shared her tent. He'd told jokes while they cleaned blood from the instruments. He died holding pressure on a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding, and she'd been the last one to touch him before the plastic bag. The Pentagon had erased him from every database. Had erased all 17 of them. Had erased Captain Rachel Torres along with them. Now she was being erased again. Except this time, she'd done it to herself by saving a man's life. The basement laundry room hummed with the sound of industrial washers cycling through their programs. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead with the rhythm of something slowly dying. Rachel set down her box of belongings and pulled out her hospital scrubs, the last ones, the ones she'd worn during the code, the ones that were still slightly stiff with Colonel Harrison's blood dried into the blue fabric. She separated them into clean and soiled. The soiled ones went into the red biohazard bin. The clean one she folded with the same creases she'd once used on her dress uniform, thirds, then halves, then a tight roll with precision that made the corners sharp enough to cut. Muscle memory. That's all this was. A body remembering how to say goodbye. She'd been hiding for 3 years. 3 years of temp agency rotations, of fake references constructed so carefully they'd never been checked, of moving between hospitals every 3 months so nobody could ask questions about her background or her credentials or why her medical knowledge seemed to come from somewhere much darker than nursing school. 3 years of being invisible. 3 years of believing that if she was quiet enough, careful enough, small enough, she could fade into the civilian world and finally stop being the woman who'd held a dead medic in her arms while the war crimes got classified. And it had taken 14 minutes, the length of a code, the length of a thoracotomy, the length of a man being saved, to undo it all. To remind her that you couldn't be less than what you were. You couldn't fold yourself small enough to fit in spaces that didn't want you. Some part of you would always be too large, too trained, too dangerous for a room full of people who'd never held death in their hands and refused to let go. The security officer waited by the service exit. Polite. Professional. The kind of man who didn't ask questions about why a nurse was being walked out in the middle of her shift. She handed him her deactivated badge. The weight of it was already gone. The weight of being Rachel Torres, just Rachel, not Captain, not Reaper, not the woman who'd extracted 12 wounded under fire and lost a team doing it, was infinitely heavier. She walked across the parking lot toward her car. Rain was starting to fall, the kind of late summer Denver rain that came from nowhere and disappeared just as fast. The asphalt was already shining. She could smell the wet concrete, the ozone residue from the afternoon heat. Behind her, the hospital lights blazed like something that mattered. Upstairs, in a room she'd probably never see again, Colonel Harrison was waking up with a chest tube and memories of the woman who'd killed him for 27 seconds and then brought him back. She wondered if he'd survive. She wondered if he'd remember her face. She wondered if the flag in her box would ever mean anything to anyone again, or if it would just be fabric, just thread, just weight, just the heavy silence of people the government had decided never existed at all. She opened her car door. Started the engine. Waited for it to warm up like she'd done 1,000 times before, waiting for the next shift, the next hospital, the next careful erasure of Captain Rachel Torres into nothing at all. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that somewhere above her, in a hospital room at 3:02 a.m., a colonel from Special Forces was reaching for his call button with an urgency that came from finally remembering who she really was. The state nursing board investigator's voice came through the conference room speaker at 8:14 a.m. on a Tuesday, crisp and bureaucratic, requesting Dr. Pierce's immediate presence for a formal interview regarding complaints filed at St. Michael's Hospital. Pierce hung up assuming it was routine, a formality, a box to check before they cleared him for the Rachel Torres termination he'd orchestrated. He'd done this before. A few phone calls to the right people, a sympathetic ear from the medical director, and problems disappeared. He'd built his entire career on making problems disappear. He arrived at the state building downtown wearing his best suit, the tailored charcoal that cost more than most residents made in a month, and walked into a conference room where 3 federal investigators were sitting beside the state board chairman. Not sitting across from him. Sitting beside him. The distinction meant something. The lead investigator was a woman with steel-gray eyes and a voice like a tank idling in a garage, and she didn't waste time with pleasantries. She opened a file and slid photographs across the table, email chains, billing records, handwritten notes from hospital archives. Pierce's handwriting. His words. His signature on patient consent forms for surgeries that had never been performed. The blood drained from his face in a way he couldn't control. Dr. Marcus Pierce, the investigator said, and every word landed like a hammer strike. In the course of verifying a complaint filed by you against nursing staff, we discovered something interesting in your personnel file. She didn't call them his crimes. Not yet. Not until the legal formalities were finished. But everyone in that room knew what they were looking at. 3 years of malpractice complaints that Pierce had personally buried in hospital archives, signed off by a medical director who was now sitting in his own lawyer's office downtown. Pharmaceutical kickback documentation. Email chains where Pierce discussed payments, not gifts, payments from manufacturers in exchange for preferential prescribing. Surgeries billed to insurance companies with forged patient signatures. 23 of them. 23. The investigator placed a spreadsheet in front of him and walked her finger down the list. Each one carries separate criminal charges, she said, her voice carrying no anger, just mathematical precision. Insurance fraud. Falsifying medical records. Practicing medicine without appropriate informed consent. The financial total, by our calculation, is approximately $847,000. Pierce opened his mouth. Closed it. His lawyer, who he'd hired with a phone call made in the hospital bathroom, leaned over and whispered something that made Pierce's hands shake for the first time anyone had ever seen. The investigator continued, her voice like concrete. The hospital's IT department recovered deleted emails from your hospital account. The ones you thought were scrubbed. She produced printouts. Communication with a Pfizer representative discussing a $50,000 quarterly arrangement. Text messages with a surgical supply vendor about commissions in exchange for exclusive equipment contracts. A handwritten note in Pierce's own handwriting that said, "Patient won't know the difference." That note was dated 6 months ago. That note was about a patient who'd sued for medical negligence. That patient had lost vision in one eye. The room compressed. The walls seemed closer. Pierce's breathing became shallow, and for the first time in his life, he understood what panic felt like, not the intellectual concept, but the actual physical sensation of knowing the ground beneath you had collapsed and there was nothing below except the fall. Your medical license has been suspended pending formal investigation, the state chairman said. His voice carried no judgment. That somehow made it worse. You are restricted to non-surgical practice, diagnostic consultation only, pending the outcome of criminal charges. You are prohibited from patient contact in any surgical capacity. You will surrender your DEA prescription rights by end of business today. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The investigator placed one final folder on the table. Rachel Torres's entire medical file. Her certifications, all legitimate. Her credentials, all authentic. Her employment history, all verified. Everything she'd been accused of lying about was completely, meticulously documented and genuine. The nurse you filed complaints against, the investigator said, her steel-grey eyes holding Pierce's, has been completely exonerated. She's being reinstated with back pay and an apology from hospital administration. You, however, are being referred for criminal prosecution." The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Pierce's lawyer stood up and said, "We're done here," and that was the moment Dr. Marcus Pierce, who had built an entire career on being untouchable, became someone the system could finally reach. His phone calls after that went to voicemail. His allies stopped answering. The medical director he'd groomed for 3 years was now cooperating with investigators and throwing Pierce under every legal vehicle available. By noon, the hospital's PR team had issued a statement calling the investigation a serious matter and committed to full cooperation with law enforcement. By 2:13 p.m., Pierce's name was on every news station in Denver. By 4:19 p.m., the hospital board had accepted his resignation and was already preparing statements about improved oversight and recommitment to patient safety, which conveniently required distancing themselves from Pierce entirely. He spent that evening in his lawyer's office signing documents that reduced his life to legal exposure and contingencies. Criminal trial scheduled for 18 months out. Civil suits already being filed by previous patients. The medical board would take 6 months minimum to formally revoke his license. 6 months of being a doctor who couldn't practice medicine, walking through a city where everyone now knew his face and what he'd done. The medical supply van was delivered to his house the next morning. It was a compromise his lawyer had negotiated with a rural clinic in Nebraska that needed rotating surgical staff for specialty procedures. Pierce could practice non-surgical medicine there, generate income, and stay out of courtrooms for as long as possible. It wasn't a career. It was exile in a white van with magnetic panels on the sides. Upstairs at St. Michael's, something entirely different was happening. Rachel had been found in a parking lot by a captain from 160th SAW who'd arrived 6 hours after Colonel Harrison woke up and whispered her call sign to a room full of military personnel. The captain had approached her with the kind of formality that only existed in elite military circles, addressed her as "M," and carried her cardboard box of personal effects back into the hospital while security awkwardly stepped aside. The general arrived at noon. 2 stars on his shoulder and the bearing of someone who'd spent 40 years making decisions that affected nations. He walked directly to the ICU without stopping at administration. The entire floor knew he was coming. The vibes had changed the moment Rachel's former security escort came back through the doors, not to escort her out, but to escort her up. The general found Rachel in Colonel Harrison's room, standing at the foot of the bed reviewing his post-operative notes while the colonel watched her with the kind of expression people got when they finally found proof that impossible things were real. "Captain Torres," the general said, and he didn't ask permission to enter. He closed the door behind him. What happened in that room, nobody would ever know for certain, but the room's feeling afterward, it was the feeling of official recognition after 3 years of official erasure. The general emerged 15 minutes later and conducted a formal salute in the ICU hallway, not the casual hand-to-brow gesture of everyday military courtesy, but the rigid chest-thump salute that came from formal ceremony. He held his hand against his heart and tilted his head slightly toward Rachel, and that small gesture meant everything. The entire hallway had gone quiet. Dr. Webb was standing frozen in shock, his chart falling from his hands. The nurses who had watched Pierce destroy Rachel were watching her be rebuilt in real time by an officer whose rank meant that the Pentagon had noticed, had investigated, and had decided she'd been wronged. The general spent another hour in administration and then drove away with Rachel's original Pentagon file in a secure folder. By evening, the hospital had issued its own statement. Rachel Torres was being offered her position back with commendations, back pay covering her 3 years of temp work, and a formal apology from hospital administration for allowing workplace harassment. The press release called her a valued member of our trauma team without mentioning why she'd been erased in the first place. That story would come later, when the classified sections of her file could be declassified, when the Kandahar operation could finally be acknowledged, when the 13-star flag could come out of the locker and hang openly. But that was weeks away still. For now, there was simply the fact that Captain Rachel Torres existed again in official capacity. 6 months passed. Pierce's criminal trial date loomed in the calendar like a storm approaching the horizon. His restricted license meant he could take vital signs and write prescriptions for antibiotics in a clinic that served a population of maybe 2,000 people in rural Nebraska. The medical supply van was his office now, his status symbol reduced to magnetic panels and a route between 3 clinics and a surgical center that didn't want him in the OR. He lived in an apartment above a hardware store. He ate lunch alone. The people in Nebraska didn't know who he was, which meant they treated him like everyone else treated him now, with basic indifference and professional distance. It was worse than hatred would have been. Rachel watched from the ICU break room window on the day the 75 operators arrived. They came in full dress blues and gathered in formation outside St. Michael's main entrance at exactly 1,100 hours. She could see Webb there, still recovering from his open abdomen but cleared for duty status, standing front row in a line with Colonel Harrison beside him. Both of them looking up at the hospital as if it were a monument. The general descended from a black sedan and approached the formation with that same knife-edged bearing he'd carried 3 years ago. They'd arranged this ceremony in advance, Rachel knew what was coming, had watched the preparations all week. But standing here in scrubs that actually fit and a hospital badge that read Captain Rachel Torres, Special Operations Medical Liaison, she still felt the vertigo of a woman pulled back from the dead. Below, the ceremony began. The general read citations. Webb was recognized for action under fire and recovery. Colonel Harrison was formally commended for his role in identifying a critical intelligence asset, which was Pentagon speak for Rachel, who had prevented compromised security protocols from spreading through military medical networks. Each commendation was precise, formal, and carefully worded to reveal almost nothing while confirming everything for anyone who understood military language. Then Rachel's name was called. She didn't go down to them. She didn't need to. The general looked up at the window where she stood, held eye contact across the 6 stories of Denver air between them, and rendered a salute so sharp it could have drawn blood. The entire formation followed. 75 people, all at attention, all acknowledging her at once. The sound of it traveled all the way to the parking lot across the street where Pierce was loading boxes into his van. He glanced up once, just once, at the formation of soldiers in dress blues, at the woman they were saluting, at the general whose salute meant this wasn't mercy or recognition. It was institutional acknowledgement that Captain Rachel Torres had been right and he had been catastrophically, criminally wrong. He got in the van and drove toward Nebraska without looking back again. The ceremony lasted 20 minutes. Afterward, Rachel returned to work, to the ICU where she belonged, where her assignment now included developing trauma protocols for Special Operations Medical Command. The 13-star flag was back in her locker, hanging openly next to a set of dress blues that had been tailored by someone who understood the specific fit of combat-grade uniforms. Colonel Harrison passed her in the hallway that evening and simply nodded. Webb approached her at the med station and asked permission to speak freely. Rachel looked at the young medic with his still healing surgical wounds and his eyes that finally understood. "Granted," she said. "I was in the next compound," Webb said. "We heard what you did in Kandahar. All of it. The teams never forgot. We were waiting to see if you'd remember us." Rachel placed her hand on his shoulder, the gesture of a commanding officer acknowledging a soldier who'd served without complaint in impossible circumstances. "Welcome back," she said. The rest of the night unfolded like any other shift in the ICU. Vital signs, medication rounds, charting, the quiet work of keeping broken people alive through the darkest hours. But when Rachel stopped at the window near the end of her shift and looked down at the city lights of Denver stretching out below the hospital, she understood something she'd forgotten how to feel. She was finally visible again. Not hidden. Not erased. Not pretending to be someone smaller than herself. A nurse named Rachel Torres, who had once been Captain Rachel Torres of Special Operations Command, was exactly who she was supposed to be, standing exactly where she needed to stand, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The broken people would keep coming through those doors, needing their lives put back together by hands that knew how to work in impossible circumstances. And she would be here to answer. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. If you've made it this far, you know Rachel's story, and you know the truth about the people we overlook. Subscribe for more stories like this one, because the most powerful people in any room are often the quietest. Like this video, leave a comment telling me, would you have had the courage to stand silent while someone tried to destroy you, knowing the truth was enough? And share this with someone who needs to remember that invisible strength is still strength.